Welcome to the Philoctetes Center. Francis Levy and I are co-directors of the center. Today's program, Psychoanalysis and Neuroscience, 10 years later. The 10 years later really was more about the Journal of Neuropsychoanalysis that saw the first issue come out 11 years ago, I think. I will introduce the people in the panel. I won't say everything that is on this paper because you all have that. And I'll start alphabetically. Cristina Alberini is professor of neuroscience and psychiatry, and she's at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. She has participated in many of the roundtables here, and her research is in the area of memory, in particular consolidation and reconsolidation of memory. She is also part of a small group that we have here with Donald Pfaff and Heather Berlin and a few other people, and discussing the unconscious. Heather Berlin, who is part of that group, is an assistant professor of psychiatry at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. She conducts research on brain lesion and impulsive, compulsive, and dissociative disordered patients. I think her main interest is in dissociation, or it's one of her main interests. She's also written papers in particular about the unconscious, but not for the cognitive unconscious, not the dynamic unconscious. Vittorio Gallese is an internationally known neuroscientist. He's professor of human physiology at the University of Parma. He's one of the two people who discovered mirror neurons that have had a major impact in thinking about the brain and the mind. Robert Michels is the Walsh McDermott University Professor of Medicine and Psychiatry at Weill Cornell College of Medicine, or Medical College. He's a training and supervising analyst at Columbia Psychoanalytic Training Program. He's the joint editor-in-chief of the International Psychoanalytic Journal, and he is a deputy editor of the American Journal of Psychiatry, and has written extensively on a large number of subjects, and has particular opinions about the subject of today's roundtable. Donald Pfaff has also been to many of our roundtables here. Some he has proposed and we have organized them. He is professor and head of the Laboratory of Neurobiology and Behavior at Rockefeller University. And he is a brain scientist who uses neuroanatomical, neurochemical, and neurophysiological methods to study the cellular mechanism by which brain controls behavior. He's also received numerous awards and is on the editorial boards of many journals. Mark Solms is the professor and chair of neurophysiology at the University of Cape Town Psychology Department. He's a neuroscientist and a psychoanalyst, a major figure in the subject that we are discussing today, has won numerous awards, including the International Psychiatrist Award from the American Psychiatric Association. His book, The Brain and the Inner World, has been translated into 12 languages. That's it. So I've asked him to give us a brief summary of what the subject of today's roundtable is going to be, and then we'll get going.
Thanks very much, Ed. As you pointed out, it's slightly artificial for us to look at the question in terms of 10 years. The field, who knows when it started, the attempt to link neuroscience with psychoanalysis, you could say it started in 1895, with very good arguments. My own personal involvement in it began in 1986, almost precisely 100 years after Freud's efforts. In your journal, the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, I published a paper called On Psychoanalysis and Neuroscience, Freud's Attitude to the Localizationist Tradition. And for me, that was the beginning of my attempts to bring the two fields together. So the question of our round table, what progress have we made? To me, I dated from then. In a sense, well, I'll get back to that in a moment. Just to say, my own training was, I trained in neuropsychology. I'm chair of neuropsychology, not neurophysiology. But I trained in a very classical behavioral neurological tradition. And I then moved on to train in psychoanalysis. And I think that in doing that, which at that point, and this speaks to the question of how far have we got to, I mean, I was really, it was mad to do that. You know, it was, I was in the Division of Neurosurgery at the Royal London Hospital by day, and I was at the Institute of Psychoanalysis in London by night, and it was Jekyll and Hyde, and I literally had to hide it. You know, what I was doing, it would have completely undermined my credibility with my hospital and academic colleagues. So that's a beginning of a measure of how far we've got. But the point is that that was not unusual 100 years earlier. We forget Freud was a neuroscientist. He was a clinical neurologist of some considerable note. He was also a neuropsychologist, at least as far as the physiology is concerned, and he had smatterings of influence on other aspects of behavioral neurology of his day. And then went on to write these, monumental texts culminating in the project. And his early first generation of followers, many of them had similar backgrounds. And we really forget that today. It was a commonplace. The education I had 100 years later was the typical sort of education of the first generation of psychoanalysts. And I say that because what seemed to me to be obvious, having traversed that same sort of educational grounding, was no longer obvious 100 years later, either to psychoanalysts or to neuroscientists of all varieties. There'd been this absolute parting of the ways, to the point that, as I said, to train in both fields was considered treacherous by both sides. Nevertheless, that's where the field started, and I think that there are absolutely obvious, unmissable continuities between the disciplines. Once you've trained in both, you just can't help but see them. So my own attempt to get going what later became neuropsychoanalysis was a simple, obvious next step that you have to take. Once you know about what's happening in the neurosciences in the 1980s, so obviously of relevance to so much in psychoanalysis, the thing to do is to convey that to your analytic colleagues, and vice versa. So much that was still missing in the neuroscience of the 1980s, about the richness and complexity and subjectivity and agency of the mind and all of that, which psychoanalysis is all about, and had such a rich theoretical and indeed even methodological armamentarium to offer. That was the obvious thing to do, was to build bridges between the two. So that's what neuropsychoanalysis was meant to be. It was meant to be an attempt to build bridges between two disciplines which had so much in common, which had so much to teach each other. So how far have we got in the intervening period? I think it's a very short period of time, considering the enormity of the chasm between the two. I think we've achieved a lot. I'm very happy with how much we have achieved. But I suppose one measures it in terms of what one's goals were. I can only speak for myself. I never wanted to create a new discipline. I never believed we would merge these two things into one new beast called neuropsychoanalysis. It was meant to be a bridge between two different disciplines, which are different for very good reasons. They're things that that they do which are incompatible with each other. But there's this cross-fertilization that was lacking, which is obviously necessary. And that's all that we sought to achieve. The fact that we now we have since the 10 years ago that you referred to, we have a journal, we have an international society. It's got, God knows, 3,000 members. We've got groups all over the world. We have an annual congress. They're very well attended. And we have young researchers doing, not 100 of them, not 1,000 of them. We've got a handful of good ones doing good work. We've made real inroads. The psychoanalytical point of view is now very well represented in, for example, dream science, in anosognosia, in confabulation, increasingly in recent years also in relation to some other topics which perhaps we'll get to later. the opposite has happened less than I would have hoped, and that's been a surprise to me. I would have thought that it would be more difficult to get neuroscientists to open their minds to this pseudoscience, this kind of palmistry of psychoanalysis, than for psychoanalysts who are truth-loving and reality-oriented, open-minded people. You would think that anything that you can tell them that's got evidence-based about, hello, this is news, this is irrelevant to you, that they would want to know it. But no, there's been enormous resistance from psychoanalysts of a very disappointing kind, more than I anticipated. But, you can't have everything. If I can say one last thing, the thing that surprised me the most is a method that I recommended and published findings from as more than 10 years ago, and presented in this institute, 15 years ago. That is doing psychoanalytical clinical investigations of patients with focal brain lesions. I really thought that was the way that we were going to get psychoanalysts properly involved in this task. But, try as I might, it's like dragging, a mule, and they won't do it, and I don't know why. They don't seem to get it. So there are a few small groups here and there who are doing that sort of work. For me, that would have been the way forwards for psychoanalysts to engage in proper neuropsychoanalytical research, to make contributions directly to topics of neuroscientific interest that neuroscientists, especially neurologists and neuropsychologists, would be able to understand. But that hasn't happened in the way that I'd hoped.
Why do you think?
Are you taking questions now?
I don't know the format.
Not yet. Not yet.
Probably I should identify myself. I'm here from another panel and in the wrong room. I've been a friendly, critical questioner of the attention paid to neuropsychoanalysis. Mark listed a group of people who've had careers, and there were others that bridged the two fields. It's almost always in the same direction. They always start out with an interest in brain and then move over to an interest in psychoanalysis and mind. And my own view of that is they're probably, many of them, I'm one of them, many of them are probably disappointed in their ability at the current state of brain knowledge and research to ask the kinds of questions that first drew them to an interest in brain. And so they move to a method and a discipline that's more felicitous for those kinds of questions, dropping the methodology of neuroscience behind, but asking the questions of mega relevance that attracted them in the first place. There's no question that a bridge is attractive, but you should build bridges between two structures that are close enough together so they can support the span of the bridge and that it's useful to move back and forth across it. A bridge between Tokyo and Los Angeles would not be a good idea in 2010. And I guess I think of neuropsychoanalysis as a bridge between Tokyo and New York, perhaps at this point, gradually moving to Los Angeles, but still not up to Honolulu. That's one comment. We'd have to get into details to talk about why that's true. But one very striking thing is the psychoanalysis that seemed most amenable to a dialogue with neurosciences is the psychoanalysis of 60 or 70 or 80 years ago, not the psychoanalysis of 2010. It was Freud's psychoanalysis. But psychoanalysis has changed an awful lot since 1895, and even more since 1939. And many psychoanalysts today see the central issues of psychoanalysis dealing not with the events within the patient, but the events in the consultation room, the transactions between analyst and patient, transference, countertransference, co-construction, hermeneutics, narrative. Those are words that aren't easily built into the bridge to psychoanalysis compared to Freud's psychoanalysis and his interest in the inner workings of the patient's mind, or for that matter, the etiologic events that led to neurotic behavior. Most current psychoanalysts focus their central attention on questions that are still quite far from the vast majority of current neuroscientific research and interest. And my impression, Mark would know much more about this than I, is that most neuroscientists with an interest in psychoanalysis have a somewhat old-fashioned definition of the psychoanalysis they're interested in. I think neuroscience advances are absolutely fascinating. One of the most exciting things that happens in my life is every once in a while, my office is across the street from Donald's, and we have lunch together. If I'm lucky, he takes me to Rockefeller for lunch. Otherwise, we go to Cornell for lunch. But either way, we have lunch together, and I find out about what he's doing and what he's interested in. But I can't say it's of interest to me because I'm a psychoanalyst. It's of interest to me because I'm interested in what's exciting and interesting and fascinating in modern science. That's a wonderful argument for psychoanalysts being interested in neuroscience. But in terms of its relevance to their clinical or theoretical work, to their interest in mental activities, to their daily interactions with patients, it has yet to demonstrate its relevance.
Sometimes for a neuroscientist, the oldest questions are the best. And if you keep your question simple enough, you can build that bridge. I'm not sure if it's Yokohama to Tokyo or Kyoto to Kamamura. But the physiologic side of libido, the most primitive concept that you could have, has already been explained. And it's true that a psychoanalyst will always be able to jump ahead of the bench, the neuroscientist working at the lab bench. He'll always be able to make something complicated that the neuroscientist that week will not explain. Give me an alpha, and you'll give me a beta. So the fact that we're starting small is not to be ashamed of, and I wouldn't give up on it.
No, you have to wait until the meeting, this part is stopped, then we come. Vittorio.
Well, I would dispute the length of the bridge. Through my lenses, it looks not as long as between Los Angeles and Tokyo, let alone New York and Tokyo. And one reason is that, as you rightly said, psychoanalysis has changed a lot. And one topic of my conversation with an Italian psychoanalyst who recently passed away, who's also a member of the original Moruzzi team, where Giacomo Rizzolatti came from, Mauro Mancia, who had a very unhappy fate because, as you said, he had to hide his psychoanalytic identity among neuroscientists, and on the other hand, they were making him feel shame being a neuroscientist among psychoanalysts. And his crucial point was that after Klein, Melanie Klein, the relevance of the interpsychic dimension becomes more and more relevant in psychoanalysis. And nowadays, cognitive neuroscience happens. I'm not talking about mirror neurons necessarily. This is just one element of a much larger picture. The social dimension of cognition is becoming more and more important, and more people tend to leave behind the disembodied and false account of how the mind works, basically related to theoretical enterprises, this sort of things that our cognitive colleagues like so much. So the body becomes more and more the real protagonist of this story. So for someone like Freud, who substantially, constantly underline the bodily nature of the I think it makes the possibility to entertain this dialogue much more available nowadays than 20 or 30 years ago. So, yeah, that was
So I'm one of these basic neuroscientists that sort of then looked at the other side of the fence and said, well, what's going on over there? And I'm of the thought that anything that's happening in the mind is happening in the brain. So if this therapy works, something obviously is going on in the brain, whether it's via the old theories of psychoanalysis or the newer ones that are more interactive. There's still something changing in the brain, and that's what I'm interested in. And using modern technology and the techniques we have in scientific method, can we look at it in the lab? Can we study it? Can we break it apart into its essential pieces and maybe actually inform psychoanalysis to improve it based on what we know with the brain? So go back and forth. But I've had discussions with analysts where I said, can we take this in the lab and can you help give me input? How do you think this would be amenable to scientific inquiry? And they've been really, obstinate. You can't, because it's an individual process. And our method is we take, let's say, 10 healthy people and 10, dissociative patients and do some tests with them. And they say that's impossible. You can't group these people together. It's an individual process, and therefore it can never be studied in the lab. And that's like saying, okay, well, is there a soul, or you need to have faith, and you just can't study it. You never know either way. And I think that unless we begin somewhere, you can be defeatist in the beginning and say, well, it can never happen and they're too far apart. But you need to start small and build your way up and say, how can we look at this in the lab? So what I do is say, let's look at phenomena like dissociation or suppression or repression and do controlled studies and see what's happening in the brain. I mean, there are studies now, we were just talking over lunch about a new study came out where they can actually scan two people simultaneously having a conversation, and you can see the interaction that's going on in the neural processes, and that they found that actually when somebody's understanding what somebody is saying, they can correlate that with them having more synchronized activity between the two brains. So I think it is amenable to scientific inquiry, and we just have to figure out ways in which to do it so it would be most efficient. And have a dialogue. If you say, well, there's other ideas in psychoanalysis that you're not getting at, then we can try to figure out ways in which we can look at it. But without a dialogue, we're not going to get anywhere. And also the newer techniques we have. I mean, we can look at now. We're doing things like deep brain stimulation. We can record neurons in humans while they're awake. I mean, how can we take these techniques and translate them over to these larger questions, to these more psychoanalytic ideas? And I think it's open to inquiry, but we should at least discuss it.
I have to agree with you that as a working neuroscientist, that if something is going on in the mind, it's also going on in the brain. But I have to admit that it may not always be helpful to try to reduce mind talk in some cases to brain talk. And the analogy that I would give is between statistical mechanics and thermodynamics. Everything that goes on in thermodynamics has to go on in statistical mechanics, but the elegant laws of thermodynamics become looking a little bit like a zoo in statistical mechanics. And so in that case, the upper level description may be more useful.
But it's an emergent property. I mean, at what point do these firing of neurons and these neural circuits emerge into these, thoughts? And, is it emergent, and can they interact? And if so, how?
Right. I totally agree actually with that. And I'm going to repeat a little bit what she says probably in a little bit of a different angle. But I think we're talking at different levels here. And I wonder actually, I wanted to ask Bob if this disagreement about can they merge, can we build a bridge, is because we're talking about two different aspects of it. And that's okay. I mean, neuroscience is not going to become psychoanalysis, and psychoanalysis is not going to become neuroscience, but there is one informing the other. So I come very much from the same background, and to me it was fascinating at one point studying memory, and particularly how memory are retrieved. What happened in the brain when we retrieve a memory. And at one point we discovered, fairly recently, although the first discoveries were done in the 60s, but now it became very much clear that when we retrieve memories, the retrieved memory, that one selectively, become fragile. And by doing that, it can change. So one of these processes that characterize this lability of the retrieved memory is called reconsolidation, meaning the memory becomes stable again over time, becomes labile with the retrieval, and then over time it stabilizes again. And during this time window, so there is a time window, during this time window, while the memory gets stronger again, new association can form with this retrieved memory. So if the memory is not retrieved, cannot form new associations. So that became obvious to me that this has a lot to do with what goes on in a therapeutic setting. Memories are retrieved, and then we make new associations, whether there are internal processes going on that. So therefore we make association between something that we remember and something else that we remember, or the emotional state that changes, or the relationship with the therapist, or what the therapist says. And so it became obvious to me that a neuroscientific question was very much linked to something that has to do a lot with the therapy and the psychoanalytic process, because from there we can go in many other directions. So I wonder if this bridge, which I agree is difficult, I mean, I see difficulties, I see resistance, and this was Mark was saying. I see resistance from the neuroscientists as well. I don't talk about my training in psychoanalysis very easily among neuroscientists. I am training in psychoanalysis because there is skepticism. And so I think we are still in two different places here, neuroscientists and psychoanalysts, but it's obvious that there is so much that we can learn from each other.
The skepticism is, to me, a social political issue, not a scientific one. And it's largely related to the undesirable motives on the psychoanalytic side for the link to neurosciences. Psychoanalysts, for the most part, don't expect to learn anything of interest or value to them from the neurosciences. But they do crave the social legitimacy and the validity of their desire to be seen as a scientific enterprise that they feel that bridge will give them. So they're very enthusiastic about the existence of the bridge and very uninterested in what they'll see while they cross it or what they'll learn when they get to the other side. They want brain research to validate what they're already certain of, not to learn something they don't yet know. And that's a very bad motive for good science.
I agree.
I'm glad that, it seems that all of us are in agreement except for the chap from the other panel. So I think this is going to be the focus of the discussion, and I'm glad to hear what you've just said, because if I may translate it, what you're saying is the psychoanalysts are more prejudiced. It really is prejudice. It's to say, in a kind of straight-faced way, psychoanalysts don't expect to learn anything from the neurosciences is like, Jesus, how can they be so prejudiced? How can they really believe they're not going to learn anything from the neurosciences? And it's a kind of a fundamentalistic attitude, and it is resistance, and it's the thing that they should know about. It's narcissism. It's narcissism. And as to the other motive, the other side of it, when you say they're unhealthy motives, that they're seeking scientific legitimacy and all the pats on the back that come with being evidence-based and so on, I say yes, and what's wrong with that? The social legitimacy, for the most part, comes with the fact that it's evidence-based. Hello, it's that's good.
Neuroscientific evidence won't validate psychoanalysis.
You see, this is what I'm speaking about. It's just incredible. It's like it's an absolute fundamentalistic starting point that this is not going to happen. That's it.
How do you know?
How can it?
Well, come on, this is not geometry. If you say something like that, you have to be able to prove it.
The validation that psychoanalysts want is the evidence that supports their claim to the efficacy of their intervention in terms of mental health.
Is that called primary process?
No. Oh. That they want to be able to claim that if you participate in the procedures they've developed, You'll feel differently at the end. You'll think differently. You'll be better. You'll have fewer symptoms. You won't be depressed. You won't be anxious. You'll be happier in your relationships. If you were able to demonstrate that psychoanalysis regularly and repeatedly led to brain changes that didn't occur without it, that doesn't validate psychoanalysis.
It might not validate it, but it might improve it.
It might. I'm talking validate now.
I mean, we could get to better methods, quicker methods.
Absolutely. I agree with you. But we're not talking that now. We're talking validating it. That's what I said. And that can't happen from neuroscience.
But this goes back to the earlier part of our discussion. I think that it is simply not a reasonable position, not a defensible position to say, well, we only want to have answers to the most complex questions. We only want to see things in an absolutely integrated, real-world, ecologically valid way. We don't want to know anything about the component parts that make up that whole. That just means I don't want to know. I have resistances. I don't want to. This scares me, or this makes me feel small, or it makes me feel old-fashioned, or it makes me feel out of fashion, so I don't want to know about it. And I think that that's a problem that psychoanalysts have got to get over.
I think you're caricaturing an argument,
because it's not just a matter of can we find neuroscientific evidence to show that this type of interpretation works. That is the end point of a whole complex building up of a body of knowledge over 100 years, and I think that those starting points, the sort of fundamental theoretical assumptions, hard won through the early pioneers of our field, and the smaller, simpler concepts, everything that comes after that, including these very complex and clinically applied questions that you're wanting us to begin with, those are the end.
No, Mark, you're saying things I didn't say. My claim is this is not the reasonable next step in our endeavors. Not that it's forever worthless, and not that it can give us nothing now. The claim is that with our resources, this is not the most prudent or wise or interesting way of expending them. The claim would be that when neuroscience can give interesting explanations about the brain basis of doing arithmetic or remembering your telephone number, then we can ask questions moving on, and eventually we'll get to questions of interest to psychoanalysis. But neuroscience isn't able to give us interesting explanations of those most elementary steps yet. We barely understand attention. We don't understand the components of thinking. And to me, it's foolish to begin with highly complex questions when we don't yet have the answers to the brain substrate of very simple mental phenomena. The only reason we'd attack those highly complex questions, is because the social attractiveness of the bridge, not its usefulness in traveling somewhere we want to go.
I blame Don. You haven't been giving him good enough tutorials.
For the neuroscientist, dabbling in psychoanalysis is a little bit like a man having a mistress. He can't get along without her, but he can't be seen with her in public. Anyway,
half the audience is going to turn off of you. You better be careful.
The order of discovery, the time series of discoveries in neuroscience, does not follow the a priori estimation of difficulty. For example, we now know in remarkable detail how entire series of motivated behaviors expressed in laboratory animals in a manner depressingly similar to human beings are regulated, and yet we still don't know how we walk, or how a rat walks, a cat walks, a mouse walks.
But just for the record, forgive me for speaking a little bit too much, but I absolutely do agree that there are some questions, many questions, that are best answered absolutely purely by psychoanalytical means, and that that it would be foolhardy to try to tackle or reduce or distort into neuroscientific pigeonholes at this point. I absolutely agree with that. It's not the one field is to be mapped one-to-one onto the other. It's just that there's such an obvious, gigantic area of overlap. There's so much plainly to be seen, to be gained by both sides in having an interaction. And there is a lot of that interaction happening. What I was saying was that the bulk of the resistance, really to me it was a great surprise to find the bulk of the resistance came from the psychoanalysts. But not all of them. And interestingly, as so often happens, the more sort of vociferous politicians get heard, it doesn't mean that they carry the day, because the British Psychoanalytical Society, where I trained, published his lead article, The Case Against Neuropsychoanalysis. And I was invited to entertain I felt like a gladiator entertaining the hordes that they invited me to enter into a debate with this Rachel Blass who wrote that paper. And it was, I really felt, well, I'm going there to be ritually slaughtered, in front of the British Psychoanalytical Society. But, what can you do? You've got to go and, defend your case.
It could have been worse if you were in France.
I've done that too. But the shock of it was that after we each presented our cases, Rachel Blass and me, Oxford Rules debate, and the audience voted, to my utter amazement, 2/3 voted with me, with my arguing for the motion that the findings of modern neuroscience are of relevance to the clinical practice of psychoanalysis. They even set up the question, in as best a way as to defeat me as possible, And but 2/3 of the analysts in that audience, which is not, it's not the New York Psychoanalytic Society.
I think there is an epistemological background related to the topic we are discussing. After all, said that neuroscience is a big word which cover a huge variety of topics and approaches. You go all the way from the molecule or the genes up to the personal level of investigation. But one thing I'm sure, psychoanalysis as a discipline is mostly interested in what a human being is all about. So every single means that sheds some more light on this topic question should be welcome, in my opinion, whether it comes from philosophy, whether it comes from art. So psychoanalysts historically weren't ashamed to establish links, bridges with artists or art historian, creative people. So science, and in particular neuroscience, is the other side of the coin. We are trying to make invisible things visible with our own peculiar level of investigation, language of description. I'm not so curious about how the brain works per se. I could even go further and say that I don't care about neurons. I use neurons as a tool to answer questions I think can be legitimately better understood if also addressed from this peculiar level of investigation. So it's not the job of neuroscientists to convince psychoanalysts they need to read a Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience. But I think that there is a particular approach, at least in social cognitive neuroscience, which, if you like it or not, is steadily and more addressing topics which are at the heart of the theory of psychoanalysis and of the clinical practice. And I found rather paradoxical that psychoanalysis, when now is the time where can utter strongly its voice in a moment in which DSM-oriented psychiatry is facing a very important crisis, when people realize that antidepressant drugs do not treat depression or things like that. I think focusing on many topics which are at the heart of psychoanalytic thought, which are finally being addressed also by cognitive neuroscience, make this time very precious. So
I think I'm
quite optimistic.
I think you're bringing up a central issue that should be discussed explicitly and that underlays the entire conversation, which is what is the definition of psychoanalysis? What are its boundaries? So you're defining it very broadly. You're saying it should be interested in everything that influences the mind and people. That's not the way most psychoanalysts today define it.
It should be interested in what a human being is.
Right, fine, even broader.
Yeah.
Most psychoanalysts would not define it that way today. In fact, that was a major issue in this building. Heinz Hartmann defined it as a general psychology. I don't think very many psychoanalysts in 2010 have any thought that psychoanalysis is even, forget everything that influences the human, they don't even see it as a general psychology.
They're dentists of the mind now.
They see it, only Mark, the only person I know who's used that phrase in writing, I believe, is Mark. But they see psychoanalysis as a specific set of issues in mental life, and not all of mental life, and certainly not all that's human. It can be, I mean, words mean whatever we want them to mean, but without that definition, it's very hard to deal with what's its relationship to neuroscience. If you define psychoanalysis as everything relevant to the human, of course it's immensely interested in neuroscience. If you define it as only interested in what are the fantasies of the human being, then you begin to ask some questions, and at least I'd say it'd be prudent to say maybe someday, but not quite yet, for neuroscience. But the definition of psychoanalysis becomes absolutely crucial in deciding what the nature of the relationship is, and particularly what the nature of the current relationship is. Your Mark is essentially defining it as roughly equivalent with psychiatry. No psychoanalyst I know would define it that way.
So can I?
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, so I'm coming at this from not necessarily from a general knowledge type of inquiry. All right, I want to understand how the brain works and how it's related to the mind. And in order to get a full picture of that, first of all, I think no one person can really fully understand it, and no one discipline. All of the different disciplines need to come together in a way for us to have a full understanding, just for the sake of knowledge. How does the brain and the mind work? How are they interrelated? In order to have a full understanding, it's like we're all sitting here with this is the full answer, this table. We have our little microscopes, and I'm looking here, and this is neuroscience, and over here this is psychoanalysis, and maybe this is psychology, and we're all looking with our little lenses, and they need to all coalesce in some way for us to have a full, complete understanding of how the brain and the mind works. And psychoanalysis, however you want to define it, maybe it's the workings of the mind, it's the intricate workings of the mind, it's in all of its facets. No matter what, it's still the substrate is the brain. And to understand this phenomena of the mind, we need to understand how the two are interrelated. And we need to find ways. I don't think it's a question of should we or when. It needs to occur for us to have a full understanding of how the brain and the mind work. If these phenomena exist, if talk therapy, however you want to construct it, works, it's working on the physical brain. And how these two things are interrelated, it's a necessity, or else we'll never fully understand. And maybe we never will. I mean, maybe we'll end up, killing ourselves or the first. But we should at least start now is the time, because, who knows how long we'll exist, and we have the knowledge. What fascinates me is that, if you think about in the grand scheme of things, this huge universe and this tiny little Earth, and then within that Earth we develop these tiny little brains, and with those tiny little pieces of matter, can understand that whole concept, and that's phenomenal. And so with that, you have psychoanalysis, you have psychology, you have philosophy, all these things. But if you don't understand the workings of that physical substrate and how they're interrelated, we're never going to answer these big questions.
I think it's part of the... Sorry, go ahead, Ed. I think it's part of the defensive position that psychoanalysis, or at least that subsection of psychoanalysis that I was talking about earlier, has worked itself into, that it starts to have to narrow its definition of what it is, until eventually it says all that we are is, we only study fantasy and nothing else. I think that psychoanalysis is one in a family of sciences that studies the mind. It's a great many different methods and techniques and theories and so on, overlapping with each other. And psychoanalysis has a particularly important part of it, which is this. Psychoanalysis studies the mind as a subject. Psychoanalysis is the science of the mind as subject, as subjective agent. Now, that doesn't mean that we have, that's our unique stomping ground, and that it's a game reserve that belongs to us and no one else is allowed in. And that's the point that Professor Gallese was making, is that increasingly it is being occupied by other disciplines, with other techniques, with other theories, with other methods. And I think that we, if we remain silent, we will play no part in the recolonization of the mind as subjective agent by other disciplines and other methods, and it'll be to the detriment both both of psychoanalysis and of neuroscience, but mostly of psychoanalysis, because the ground that it originally occupied, it will have simply given away without a fight, out of narcissistic sort of self-destructiveness.
The subject finally is back. That's the point.
Yeah.
So philosophy is getting it, neuroscience is getting it. So to me, it doesn't make any sense that psychoanalysis would refrain from exploiting this opportunity, to establish links with discipline like cognitive neuroscience, for the reason I said before. I don't know. This is not an argument at all, but I think if Freud were among us today, he would be more daring.
He'd be a neuroscientist.
I don't think so.
Sure.
But he would tackle the same issues.
He was a neuroscientist.
Yes.
It was, but also
I'd like to say a couple of things. One is, in defense of psychoanalysts, part of the problem is that psychoanalysts, unlike neuroscientists, do not really have labs, do not have grants, do not have postgraduates doing work and research for them. They sit in an office from morning to night seeing patients. That inevitably limits their capacity to be able to think in other ways and broader ways and deeper ways. And so I think some of what may come across as resistance is not resistance specific to the knowledge that neuroscience provides, but just resistance to any knowledge because it's just too much. When I was more active in the New York Psychoanalytic, I made it clear that it seemed to me there needs to be some change because we were becoming more and more like tradespeople rather than explorers of the mind. And I think that's a problem. I, on the other hand, don't find neuroscientists, there are exceptions, 2 of them are sitting here or 3 of them are sitting here, but by and large, here we are a biased view, but by and large, not every neuroscientist opens his lab and says, okay, psychoanalyst, come here and give me the kind of questions you find are interesting and we will do research on it. When we started the study group at this institute to bring neuroscientists to have conversations with psychoanalysts, it's now about close to 20 years, it must be.
It's exactly 20 years.
So one of the things that was immediately noticeable is that neuroscientists barely talk to each other. So how are they going to talk to psychoanalysts?
No, we talk, but we don't listen.
But you are extremely fragmented. It's the opposite of psychoanalysis. When you study these little things, you are so fragmented, you don't really very much care about something else, somebody else is studying on another subject. The other thing I noticed is that when you asked a neuroscientist a question like, when you did that research, did you think of this, which would have been a psychoanalytic idea? They would say, well, that wasn't in the grant. So I couldn't study that because that's not what I proposed to study. So there were those limitations, and I have a feeling those limitations continue. But on the other hand, I think a lot of ground is being made. I mean, what Cristina said with the work she's done on memory, consolidation, reconsolidation, I cannot imagine for a moment that that does not have relevance to the psychoanalyst work with memory. The work that is being done on anxiety,
right.
On post-traumatic disorder, and the way anxiety and what Ledoux has done with, I cannot imagine that those things don't have significant relevance to psychoanalysis. What Don has done with the libido, as he mentioned before, cannot but have, the mirror neurons cannot but have relevance to psychoanalysis. So I think Bob is right that we are far, but we are far not just because we are closed-minded or not because we are anxious about finding new things, but also because we don't have the means to get closer. And I think the neuropsychoanalysis program and what Mark has done over the past years has been an attempt to facilitate that work. And from what you are saying, you have had some success, but obviously a lot more needs to be done. But it's not an easy road.
Yeah, and I would like to throw another question, because I think it will be useful to know from all of us. What do you see will be helpful at this point to do? And is there something we can do to promote more of this crosstalk between the two disciplines? And I will start with Bob, because I think you said there is, this is not the way to do it. At one point you said there is something else, or maybe you are thinking about something else.
Well, several things I think would be helpful in a long-term preparation. One is, my impression is that there's much more enthusiasm in psychiatric and psychoanalytic circles for learning about what are the new advances in neuroscience. Every psychiatric residency has a course in neuroscience. You probably teach in one. It is not my impression that there's a similar symmetrical enthusiasm for people in the neurosciences learning about what are the new ideas in psychoanalysis. So my own contact with that group, which is fairly considerable, is that their knowledge of psychoanalysis goes about as far as the French. It stops in 1916.
True.
That asymmetry makes dialogue unlikely. So you need an agreement that it's worth spending time and effort acquiring a certain amount of basic vocabulary and familiarity that mostly hasn't happened. My own prejudice is that most of the things of relevance, potential relevance to psychoanalysis from the neurosciences, have to first be translated into cognitive psychology before you go the next step. And that the attempt to bridge from the brain to the mind without going from the brain to the psychologist's mind and then to the psychoanalyst's mind is skipping a step. We need an island in the middle for that bridge. And I don't think that's usually done because the social political motivation I talked about earlier doesn't extend to cognitive psychology. If psychoanalysis has a legitimate link to neuroscience, it's going to make it. If it's a legitimate link to cognitive psychology, it may pull cognitive psychology away from the sciences. The psychoanalytic community wants that legitimacy. So that, I think, has interfered with the appropriate stepwise move. Those are two things I think would make a difference.
Vittorio,
such translation, I don't see it as possibly helpful. We should bear in mind that, I don't know in this country, but in my country, a legitimate son of classic cognitive science is the cognitive behaviorist psychotherapy. And I can't imagine anything more distant from psychoanalysis than this psychotherapeutic approach. So this is exactly the point of cognitive scientists when they speak of this terrible enterprise of bringing together, establishing a dialogue, let's say, between neuroscience and psychoanalysis. That if psychoanalysts had to look out of their quarters, they should look first to cognitive scientists. And I think this will not help because classic cognitive science is wrong. I mean, we learn it day by day that you can't get away without a body. And there are different ways to deal with the body, to bring the body into a cognitive framework. Many recipes, many theories, many lines of research, many of which are mutually conflicting. Because neuroscience, first of all, is a methodology. And you can use this methodology to ask different questions and expecting to find different answers. But I think if there is something new coming out from cognitive neuroscience, is that the body is more and more being at the center of the focus of this research. And I can't see as one way to easing the establishment of this bridge, of this dialogue, more than it was possible 20 or 30 years ago.
I'd like to say, first, I think the way that you talk about psychoanalysis is sort of like almost as if you're a dualist. You know, there's this psychoanalysis world out here, and then there's the brain over there, and somehow they have to come together. But in terms of practically speaking, what I think we can do is that, so when I don't study psychoanalysis and how does it relate to the brain. I try to look at particular phenomena within psychoanalytic theory. So the idea of repression or dissociation is a phenomena that exists, and it's within the realm of psychoanalytic theory. And then we can break that down and try to look at it experimentally in a lab. How can we do controlled experiments? So what I think, practically speaking, is if we can increase the dialogue between the two disciplines, so you can say to us what phenomena within psychoanalytic theory might be amenable to this kind of the scientific method and to inquiry in a lab, in an artificial environment where we take out all the confounds and we just look at the exact neural substrate to say the phenomena of repression of a thought or an emotion. And so how can we break it apart into its root, its fundamental pieces, into these fundamental concepts that can then be amenable to neuroscientific inquiry? And I think that's a good place to begin to have this crosstalk between the two disciplines. We talk about in general terms, it's just psychoanalysis and what's that, and it's sort of the ghost thing and this machine and how they come together. But no, break it down, and that's what's happening in psychiatry now. I mean, you're talking about the disintegration of the classification, the DSM-4. What they're starting to look at now is, instead of psychiatric illnesses, this sort of the end point, the dimensions. So you have something like impulsivity, and then what's the neural basis of that, and then how can we look and target that, rather than some overarching disorder. So we break it down to fundamental pieces, dimensions, or concepts, and look at those in the light of neuroscience with all of our modern technology. And that's some way that we can bring these two things together. So
if I may answer your question, I agree with what both of you are saying, embodiment and move away from cognitive neuroscience, please. And the endophenotype approach that you're referring to, there are many different ways in which we can approach trying to make better dialogue between the two. But the thing I would like to add to that, which is not to disagree, and comes back to Ed's point. Ed said, let's not forget most psychoanalysts are sitting in a private practice consulting room. They're not in a university hospital. They don't have access to research, the tools of research and the whole sort of infrastructure of research. And I think that's true, and we need to start with that. Before getting to what I think is the solution, let me just point out that that's not unique to psychoanalysis. I mean, the whole of clinical medicine works like that.
To psychiatrists as well.
Not every doctor is a scientist, and most doctors are sitting in their consulting rooms applying what they learned.
The progress they use comes from the lab.
Yes,
doesn't come from their consulting
I agree,
room.
but I'm just wanting to differentiate. I think that's one aspect of the problem, that we don't have a lab. We only have clinicians, but so does the whole of the rest of medicine also have mostly foot soldiers doing clinical work. You can't expect of them to be running labs. So one problem is we don't cherish, we don't fund, we don't resource psychoanalytical research, which is. But I think there's a separate matter, and this is the main point I wanted to make, which is that I think that the psychoanalytical method, when you say neuroscience, is first and foremost a kind of an armamentarium of methodologies. Yeah. Likewise, psychoanalysis is first and foremost a particular methodology, and that methodology, but because of the nature of the object of study and the perspective that psychoanalysis takes on the mind, it is intrinsically a clinical method. And one of the reasons why psychoanalysts don't want to support research is because they see it as this alien thing, people counting words on, computer printouts, and they know that's actually nothing to do with us. That's not really psychoanalysis, and they disdain it. Because they know that psychoanalysis, the real stuff of psychoanalysis, the data of psychoanalysis, is arrived at in the consulting room. And that is our laboratory. So, funnily enough, the problem that I started out acknowledging, that you pointed out, is, that is our laboratory. Freud always put it that way. Every psychoanalysis is a piece of research. So, to answer your question, my recommendation is, and I've already said that I've failed dismally in this recommendation. I don't know why no one wants to listen to it, but I'll say it again one last time for today. And that is that we should be doing two things. The one is psychoanalysts should be doing clinical psychoanalytical work with patients with focal brain lesions. I've done that. I've proved it can be done. We learn. It's fascinating. We see things that the behavioral neurologist doesn't see. We learn new things about these disorders. We contribute in a language with a method that we understand, that we know. All we're doing is what we do anyway. It's an individual human being with this mental aberration which we psychoanalyze to try and understand what is this thing made of. And how can I better understand what's going on here using my psychoanalytical clinical techniques? But they don't want to do that. I don't know why. There's another thing that could be done. We could have clinical seminars about that. We could, all of us, okay, you're all seeing, patients with anosognosia. Let's all discuss them. What are we finding? What do you find? What do you find? It would be very easy to do. The other thing is even more shocking that it's not done, because it's so much closer to your actual clinical work in your day-to-day consulting room that you refer to, which is the effects of psychotropic drugs. Half of your patients, those of you who are analysts here, they're taking pretty much the same drugs. They're taking benzos, they're taking SSRIs, they're taking this, that, and the other thing. But there's nowhere a psychoanalytical clinical seminar discussing what happens psychoanalytically, metapsychologically. Let's discuss theoretically with our way of thinking about the mind psychoanalytically. What do SSRIs do? What do they do in this disorder? What do they do in that disorder? Are there subtypes? Because that's immediately, again, the data of clinical analytical work that can be fed back to, general psychiatry and psychopharmacology, and immediately there's a bridge to a whole field of neurochemistry and, and everything that goes with it, and affective neuroscience. So I still think the real problem is resistance. It can be done. It's there. It's like, I feel like I'm a kid in the toy shop.
But what you're talking about, I think, and it's really better what Ed was saying. This is the lab that is missing. This is the work that is missing. He was saying we don't have labs, we don't have resources. But I think what's missing is in the training phase, that they will need to learn that there is something that can be done, and then come up with how to do that. Doesn't need to be in a lab, doesn't need that they have to apply to huge amount of money. Maybe there are ways that can be started right now in the clinical settings, in the room, and who is interested in doing can do that. So I think it starts with the lack in the training.
I think we shouldn't misunderstand the fact that it's not that psychoanalysts are not doing their kind of research. As Mark said, every psychoanalytic session has a certain amount of discovery in it. But what we are looking for and discovering are things that we want to discover and understand in psychoanalysis. So a psychoanalyst, aside from the fact that I don't know how he's going to get all these anosognosia patients, is trying to understand how this particular mind is working. So we find a lot of things on individual basis, so I don't want that to not be recognized. The other problem we have, which I think Bob did not make it as explicit, and I think it should be, is that we no longer have one psychoanalysis. We don't have one field. There are psychoanalysts who, when I talk with, I don't think we are talking the same thing. And so there are all these breakdowns in psychoanalysis, which I originally felt, not that neuroscience would legitimize psychoanalysis, but that the understanding of the brain and understanding such things as memory, such things as dissociation and suppression and repression, that would help us eliminate all the mishmash that is entering into psychoanalysis and have a more clear understanding of how the brain works, how the mind works, and how we then apply that to our patients. But that is another problem, this fragmentation in psychoanalysis.
Schools of wisdom.
I think if everybody is okay, we can go to the question from the audience.
Come to the mic and say who you are.
Hi, I'm Sue Shapiro, and several things. One is I think it's really ironic that when psychoanalysis came to this country, medical doctors didn't want anybody who wasn't a doctor to practice psychoanalysis because they needed to understand physiology. They needed to understand biology. And then it moved so far away. And I think that, Mark, I could have helped you anticipate the resistance, because when I tried to integrate theories of schizophrenia in 1979, I found that geneticists were quite comfortable knowing that what happened in the environment would have an impact on whether somebody became schizophrenic or not. Psychoanalysts at that time didn't want to believe that there was anything genetic or biological involved. And I think people, and not just with that, but research in general, and I think, if psychoanalysts want to be seen as more legitimate, they have to be open to what's going on. You can't keep saying, can't keep thinking, well, Freud already said this, and if not, then we can't call it psychoanalysis. That infancy research, I had friends, colleagues who were analysts who didn't think there was anything useful in paying attention to infancy research, and they feel the same way that now about neurophysiology, and that's a shame.
I think there's a line, but I'm going to have a microphone brought to that side. Yeah.
So this is a question that...
could you say who you are?
I'm Akhil Bilgrami. Mark, you and I have been in touch recently on email. This is a question trying to make us build a smaller bridge between the kinds of skeptical instincts that Robert Michels has been articulating and all the rest of you have been resisting. There's no gainsaying that there's a lot of use that psychoanalysis can make of results in the study of the effect of lesions, the neurophysiological basis of confabulation, dreams, and so on. But I thought that what the point you were making was that if you get away from the old questions and look at what has been current in a lot of psychoanalysis in recent years, where what is stressed is something very distributed, when you stress transference and countertransference and dialogical things that go on in the laboratory of the analytical exchanges, you've got a phenomenon that isn't easily something you can break down to being illuminated by things that neuroscience studies. That the phenomenon is distributed because it's based on dialogical things. It's based on emancipatory outcomes of cure and so on that psychoanalysis is supposed to provide, which are normative phenomena. So when you said that you might have to go step by step and focus first on the deliverances of, say, something like cognitive psychology, and then go further down. Well, cognitive psychology is sort of a red flag, right, to people who believe that it's all bodily and so on. So that was sort of a reckless way of putting things. Because there seems to be a commitment to computation, to symbolic architectures, which leaves the body behind. And but here's my thought. My thought is, might it be in the kinds of things you were suggesting that, one looks at the interactive phenomena and sees what the brain is doing when there is an exchange, for instance. Mirroring is just, of course, one such phenomenon. But is there, Mark, this is a question addressed to you, is there a conception of the body, even the brain, which is not within the individual skin? is there a physical concept which essentially is constituted not by proximal stimuli but distal stimuli? Right, so the brain is distributed. It's not just there, but is responding to things outside in the social and physical environment, which is one of your interests, right? And the brain is something larger than what's inside. It's constituted by distal stimuli, right? And that is not just cognitive science. It's just a more capacious conception of the body and of the brain. Now, that would bring things step by step, but in, I think, a way that's not going to just be, well, cognitive psychology, so stress computation and so on, which is just, induces anxiety amongst people who stress the body. So that's just a thought.
Since it's a question for me, I'll answer it, although the person best qualified to answer it is sitting opposite me. If you had been at this morning's presentation, you would have the answer to your question. The work that Vittorio Gallese and his people are doing, people working within the paradigm that he pioneered, speaks exactly to the question that you just asked. So the answer, in a nutshell, is yes, there is. You should read his work.
Well, I think that's one of the crucial points. We should abandon the idea that when we study the brain, we study a magical box or the brain in the vat of the thought experiments of analytic philosophy. I always try to, sometimes I forget, but I should always keep in mind that what I'm dealing with is not the brain per se, but it's a brain-body system which is situated. So I probably don't go as far as people like Andy Clark, who vindicate a role for a very bold form of externalism. But, we are close to that. So the single mind is a temporary outcome of a co-construction process, which is unimaginable without the other. So, you see, so when neuroscience finally get to that point, you need a language. And that language can come from philosophy of mind, from psychoanalysis. So when I discovered that in a post-traumatic stress disorder, these poor people, we decided to come up with a very simple task, just naming basic emotions. And the study was carried out by colleagues of ours, Roberto Ravera and colleagues in Sierra Leone, 8 years after the war was over. And you discover that the former children soldier have no problem in telling disgust, surprise, anger, happiness. They have a specific failure in recognizing sadness. And most of the time, they take sadness for anger. That's the most systematic error they make. How do I call this? So when I show the data to a psychoanalyst, the psychoanalyst tell me, you see, this is denial. This is what we call denial. So I don't have the words. I have an effect, which is, I take it to be interesting. I can move one step forward or downward as a level of investigation. I can ask the same question to the same people while simultaneously scanning their brain. But still, I have a variety of brain circuits that do activate or do not activate. But I need to translate that with a language that most likely can come from your own community. And by the way, it's not true that neuroscientists do not ask questions to psychoanalysts. I don't know in here, in this country, but in Europe, the European community is funding grants, actually training grants, which is even more important, specifically aimed to support young scientists, bringing together within the same network people like me, people like Peter Fonagy, people like George Gergely, philosophers like Dan Zahavi or Thomas Metzinger. And we are doing empirical research in the Anna Freud Center. Actually, I was there at the kickoff meeting when Marie Target said, if someone asked me 20 years ago that we would have bought such a machine, point to the high-density EEG geodesic device, I would have laughed. But these things are happening. And I think as the short example I was making is one little example which shows when the neuroscientist is feeling obliged to ask questions outside his own community to find solutions.
I think it's you, then.
Actually, I have kind of a two-part question, comment, / offer. Denise Scholl, and I run a company called the Rethink Group, which has attempted to take psychoanalytic concepts and use them with traders in the market. And in fact, what we basically early on found was that traders have a transference to the market. The market is absolutely the trader's mother, and I can tell you all kinds of stories. So in a way, that was my third part. I'd offer a population maybe that we could work with, because we're very willing to be researched. But as I am a member of Mark's society, as well as the Society for Neuroeconomics and the Society for Social and Affective Neuroscience. And what I'm wondering is, are there any bridges with the neuroeconomists who are very much studying judgment and decision-making, or the social and affective neuroscientists who really are very much studying emotion? And you take theory of mind, for example, which there's a brand new study coming out about traders, actually better traders using theory of mind and other people. And so I'm asking first, is there any dialogue with those groups? And I know they tend to be cognitive, at least the neuroeconomists do. And if there's not any dialogue, maybe offer what we're doing as a bridge. But I'd just be curious. I mean, for example, the Harvard lab on judgment and decision making, and Jennifer Lerner, who's publishing a chapter in the new social psychology handbook, who says emotions are the most important, and by the way, talking about emotions is a very effective technique. I'm like, this is a woman who's running a lab at Harvard, now talking about emotion, and she's saying talking about emotions, that's some sort of bridge to psychoanalysis. So I'm curious if you all have connections, if we can build a bridge, if I can help you to build a bridge that way. Or your thoughts about what I'm saying.
A lot of neuroscientists are engaged in work that they're seeing strictly through the sort of neuroscientific lens, so looking at decision making, there's neuroeconomics, but not realizing at the same time that they're delving into psychoanalytic theory. So I wrote this review paper where I was looking at, well, I'm going to delve through all the work that's been going on in cognitive neuroscience, affective neuroscience, and see the studies that they're just doing and they don't really know, how I can pull them together and say, look, this is actually looking at psychoanalytic phenomena, and builds a sort of picture to say these are the kinds of studies that we need to sort of elaborate on to start bridging the gap more. So I think people are doing it not knowingly, or maybe serendipitously discovering, oh wait, this is something to do that might feed into. And there's a lot of neuroscientific papers where at the very end they might say, well, this could have something maybe to do with Freud's concept of repression, just as sort of a side note, and it was a sort of serendipitous finding. So if there's a way we can get them to be more conscious of what it is they're actually looking at, this phenomena, then we can start them to maybe delve into other areas, very more specifically and more be more cognizant of it.
I think that's a beautiful example of how you can start actually to make a step in this bridge, yeah.
And another one is Lisa Feldman-Barrett at Northeastern, who's studying purely emotion and what is emotion, and she has a completely unconventional idea, and she's getting a lot of pushback from the emotion. But she has this and she's willing to stand up. I don't know if she cares about psychoanalysis or not, but her work is so connected that whether she knows it or not. Lisa Feldman-Barrett at Northeastern.
I think people who call themselves neuroeconomists are more pointed toward mathematics than they are toward psychoanalysis. And it also reminds you that putting the word neuro in front of a noun. In the David Letterman sense, it doesn't make it a something. Neuroaesthetics, neuroethics. And if you'd like to read somebody who really rails about this, read Stephen Morse at the University of Pennsylvania Law School.
But it is they very much are focused on judgment and decision making. When it's all said and done, what are we focused on in psychoanalysis? Better judgment and better decision making. In any event, I've more than taken up my time. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Norman Holland, and I come here with an odd perspective because I'm a literary critic. But for me, the bridge is very short. It runs from my second molar to my incisor.
Literally.
So I was allowed to take psychoanalytic training, provided I took an oath, which I did, not to practice, which was no doubt a very good thing for the patient population. But what I would like to say is very like what the lady just said about neuroeconomics, that there are these connections. There are questions that literary critics have been asking for centuries. Why do we willingly suspend disbelief? Why do we believe in somebody as improbable as Batman? Why do we feel emotions toward fictional characters? Little Dorrit dies, and we all cry. Whatever. Why do we change our own character when we watch a violent television program or read an uplifting kind of book? And my point is that these questions are answerable. In fact, I've answered them in a book called Literature and the Brain. But leaving that aside, my point would be simply that there are these connections to things that are the traditional focus of psychoanalysis, and we now have enough neuroscience to be able to say some useful things about them.
Thank you.
I just want to say, and this may be because...
Did you identify yourself?
Oh, Siri Hustvedt. I'm neither a psychoanalyst or a neuroscientist. I'm just a roaming novelist. And my sense is actually the synthesis is here. I mean, that the bridge can be walked back, you can walk backward and forward, and that it really is here. And it's a question of vocabularies, very importantly. And that, Jürgen Habermas has a notion of expert culture and the fact that every discipline or many disciplines create a rarefied vocabulary that becomes so rarefied that you have to learn the language in order to speak it. And I have to say, studying neuroscience, that's exactly what I did. I had to learn how to read the papers. Not to speak of the parts of the brain, but this is merely a matter of some intellectual effort. It can be done. And the fact is that we are looking at perceptual frames will create differences in what you see. So a literary critic is probably going to look at the same phenomenon in a different way. But if you adopt multiple models and multiple frames to look at the same thing, you will be only richer for it. And I think it can be done with psychoanalysis and neuroscience and philosophy. And sometimes it means, in my case, learning completely alien ways of thinking. Anglo-American analytical philosophy was about the most alien thing I ever came across. But I have learned how to read their papers, and I think it has helped, even though I have a tendency not to agree with them at all. But it has helped me situate myself among these disciplines. End.
Thank you. Joel, could you let Marcia, because she's waiting, and then...
Marcia Cavell, philosopher, semi-analyst. I have a couple of questions that might be very, very short essays. I'm not sure which they are. First, it seems to me fairly easy to get a translation of very abstract concepts like repression and ego. My question here is, are these just translations? Do they help us understand what the phenomena are? The question is, let's suppose we take a man who does something extremely simple, so it seems. He gives up playing music at the age of 25. That's the event, perfectly normal human event. Now, of course, that event won't be described that way in neurology. Neurology's got these little dots in the sky, let's say, and they're not picked out in terms of young men and saxophones, etc. So my question would be, how can neurology even begin to look like that at a particular incidence? Or is the point rather that once the psychoanalyst goes to work on that, because it reaches into so many areas of the mind for any one person. So let's suppose he and the patient more or less settle on a particular description. Then in any case, you'll have the concept of motive. You'll have emotion, you'll have history. But that's going to be so large, it keeps getting larger and larger and larger. Now, once again, there's no way that I can see how neurology can possibly map that on to a neurological description. So that's my skepticism.
Thank you. Does anybody want to respond?
Yeah, I think that there are several things I'd like to say to that. The first is that I don't think that the relationship between psychoanalysis and the neurosciences is one of translation only. It's not two languages that need to be translated into each other's terminology so much as two different observational perspectives utilizing different instruments. They're literally different things you can perceive using those different instruments. And so there's a single object of study, not with two languages, but with two data sets, two different things that we can observe. And I think translating those data sets necessarily through terminologies does teach each side something else about the thing that they're perceiving, like the blind man and the elephant. I think when you share your observations from different perspectives, you learn new things. There are very few concepts, which is the second point I wanted to make, between psychoanalysis and the neurosciences, where we do have terms already referring to the same things, because it also flows from different observational lenses, that the things that you see, the objects that come into view, don't map in a one-to-one relation onto each other, therefore the terms don't. And this is partly what you were saying in your example. I think that if we can simplify the problem that you pose, though, by looking at those instances in which there is a relative one-to-one isomorphism relation between concepts and terms. Like, for example, you used the example, no, it was you, Don, used the example of libido. And Don said, we now understand more or less, the neurobiology of what libido is. And, not to put too fine a point on it, that's true. It's a very basic, very fundamental, very important psychoanalytical concept, which we understand really well also neuroscientifically. And there are things that we understand about what psychoanalysts call libido that would have been undreamt of from the psychoanalytical observational perspective. And therefore, there's a great deal that we can teach psychoanalysts about libido, and then, therefore, to make the last point, and therefore also about the things in which the concept of libido does theoretical work, which is also these much more complex lived realities that you're wanting to say neuroscience can't speak to. Because psychoanalysis is psychoanalysis, it does try and reduce things to endophenotypes of its own type, and these things, are the explanatory concepts of the lived life that you're referring to. So, for example, schizophrenia, the psychotic states that Professor Gallese was talking about earlier this morning, and in dreams, which is my own field of knowledge, we've learned new things about dreams and about psychotic states because of what we've learned about libido from the point of view of the neurosciences. So, in short, my answer is yes.
Yeah, my name is Maggie Zellner, and I'm a psychoanalyst and a neuroscientist. And so I just wanted to say a couple of things more from a personal point of view, sort of responding to the conversation. So one is, I come very much from a place of, beginning in psychoanalysis and then becoming interested in the brain. And I love psychoanalysis very much, and now as I practice, even though I know a lot about the brain, there's not all that much that happens when I'm working with a patient. where my brain knowledge sort of comes into the room. I sort of feel like what I do with a patient in the room is not very much informed by my understanding of the brain so far. I think that one of the sort of epistemological issues in the field in general could be sort of assessing where we are at the moment, is that a lot of the bridge building has been more in the realm of metapsychology, sort of understanding, having ideas about the neural underpinnings of sort of the constructs and agencies of the mind, and then more and more sort of about specific questions that have to do with sort of the treatment situation, the clinical situation. And I think that that's going to continue to change, because one of the amazing things that really is different in 2010 is that even though some of us sometimes feel a little insecure about revealing this other aspect of ourselves, depending on what situation we're in, it's not utterly shocking anymore to be both, you know. I also just wanted to say personally that for me, understanding more about the brain becomes yet another source of hypothesis building. Sort of it feeds into my hermeneutic experience of myself and other people. So I'm sitting here in the meeting, I'm like, wow, my heart's starting to beat, and I'm feeling very irritable, and I feel like the meeting is going to dissolve into two warring camps, and are actually people going to start punching each other soon? And so as I'm feeling that, I start to notice my feeling. I start to actually be curious, what's going on in my brain? I start to get curious about it from an evolutionary point of view. Why is it that if somebody has such a strong opposing viewpoint that we all want to argue about it, you know? So there's so many other things you could say about that. But for me, understanding that something's going on in my brain that's part of that experience helps me to contain it and to label it. It's an additional sort of psychoanalytic experience that I'm having with myself. And I think that as we're having the dialogue, those kind of things will happen more and more. And the last thing I just want to say is a strong vote in favor of social legitimacy for psychoanalysis. As someone who loves psychoanalysis, and psychoanalysis changed my life, and even so, I go to cocktail parties and I tell people what I do, and they say, do you really think that works? You know? And first of all, if we can devote resources to empirical outcome studies, regardless of what's happening in the black box, if we can say definitively, which we're starting to be able to do more and more, if you have psychoanalysis, you improve, your improvement lasts a long time, that's good for us as a field. If we can also then say psychoanalysis makes you feel better, and we put you in a scanner before and after, and we see changes in your brain, that's really good for us. You know, I think that social legitimacy ultimately brings psychoanalysis back into a public sphere where we've really been missing for a few decades, and we have so much to bring to the public discussion. I think that if neuroscience helps us ride the wave back into the public sphere, that it's good for us. So that's what.
Definition of improved, though. A lot of us wouldn't agree.
Well, then that's a whole separate discussion. I would say feeling less conflicted, feeling more capacity for risk-taking, feeling pleasure, being able to be clearer about where I end and you begin, et cetera, et cetera. And psychoanalysis, I think, at least with certain populations, is extremely good at that. And we need to be able to measure that and talk about it in the world.
Thank you. Joe?
Yeah,
you want to say something?
Yeah, quickly, just I want to comment the first two comments. One was that the bridge that's been most vivid or successful has been with metapsychology and psychoanalysis. But a footnote to that is metapsychology has drifted away so that most psychoanalysts have little interest in it today. It isn't discussed in the psychoanalytic journals. There are very few papers about it. So that's part of the issue, that the psychoanalysis that's most easily linked is old psychoanalysis, not new psychoanalysis. The other is your second comment about the impact that thinking about the brain has on your experience. That's, of course, not the brain. It's your fantasy about the brain. And it helps you contain something or other. I believe it does that for the profession, too. So the neuropsychoanalysis has an important effect because of its fantasy and symbolic meaning, both to the profession and to the larger community. I think that's important, but that's not about the brain.
Joel.
I'm Joel Whitebook from the Columbia Psychoanalytic Center, and I have a question and comment for Bob. First, I share your concern about the motives behind so many of our colleagues being enthusiastic about neuroscience, and I think there is a desperate wish there that it'll finally legitimate the discipline and save us, and which is wishful thinking and naive. About the question why analysts haven't been as receptive to neuroscience as neuroscientists have been to analysis, I think for most analysts it's very difficult, especially those of us who don't have medical backgrounds. It's very technical. It's a whole new world. It's vocabularies that have to be mastered, technical thinking that has to be mastered. And given the fact that we spend so many hours of the day, sitting in a room with people, it's really it's a big project to try and master.
It's easier than reading Lacan. I swear.
Oh, because it makes sense. But the main thing I want to say to Bob,
I didn't say that.
I did. Bob was saying that he thinks that most neuroscientists are interested in psychoanalysis, if not circa 1895, at least circa 1939, and that psychoanalysts aren't there anymore. They're in a very different place. But you're assuming there's something normative or desirable about the place that psychoanalysis is in today. And I would say there's a big problem, which Dr. Gallese has referred to several times, about intersubjectivity, the linguistic turn, constructionism, two-person psychology, however you want to put it, is that the body has dropped out of the whole thing. It's a form of linguistic idealism that infected analysis from philosophy, and in the process, the body has dropped out of the picture. And one of the most hopeful things about psychoanalysts becoming interested in neuroscience is that not the constructed body, but the real material body comes back into the picture.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Just a short comment. I fully agree, and I would like to bring it one step further, if possible. So, what always attracted me in psychoanalysis, or maybe it's my own personal reading or fantasy of psychoanalysis, I don't know. I'm not trained, I'm not a psychoanalyst, but I've been reading Freud and many other authors since many years. Is that what psychoanalysis is speaking about is not a specific nosography of mental diseases. And the main goal of psychoanalytic treatment is not to cure a patient, is to help an individual, Mr. B or Mr. J, to live his own existence or her own existence in a different way, doing her best to exploit the talents that nature gave to this peculiar individual, coping with a specific environment, but your own life history can be healed to a certain degree, but it cannot be turned upside down. So, since from my very beginning in my interest in psychiatry, I found more convincing a dimensional approach to the psyche rather than a categorical one. And there's plenty of examples in the history of psychiatry. If we read Kretschmer now, the picnic type, you laugh, but the basic assumption, I think, was incredibly right. And we are rediscovering old intuition with new languages, with new devices. So this is another field where I think some kind of cognitive neuroscience and psychoanalytic thought can find a common playground.
But I think you just touched on one thing that might be a roadblock here, is that the goal of psychoanalysis is about treatment, however you want to define the outcome of the treatment as a person reaching their full potential or whatnot, but that's the goal. So it's sort of how it works is less important than that it works. However, whatever means you can come at that, you have improvement in this individual. Whereas I think in neuroscience, it's just about, we want to understand, how does this thing work? And so there's two different goals there. So like when Maggie's saying, well, I'm there with the client and I'm trying to help them, and I'm not really thinking about how the brain is working. I'm just thinking about how to treat this particular individual. So we're talking two different languages in that sense, where one is very outcome based, and the other, and regardless of how it works. And so even in psychiatry, okay, ECT, electric shock therapy, it works. We're not quite sure how, but it works and it's therapeutic, and so let's do it. Whereas in neuroscience, we're saying, well, what are the mechanics behind it? How is it working? Can we see that it is working? But I want to know exactly mechanically how is that working? And I think that's sort of some barrier that we need to bridge.
There is some of that in psychoanalysis, except it's in psychoanalytic language. It's not that psychoanalysts don't ask those questions of themselves, but their answers are in the psychoanalytic language.
Or in the same language.
I just want to say one thing about this legitimacy issue, because I don't really buy into that. I don't think that I personally became interested in neuroscience because I was concerned about legitimacy, and right now I'm too old to worry about legitimacy anyhow. But I think if it were legitimacy were the issue, the psychoanalysts would be running into neuroscience constantly. It's the opposite. Psychoanalysts, majority of them avoid neuroscience. And if they would give them more legitimacy, then they would all buy into it, but they don't.
It hasn't yet delivered.
No, I think they're more. I think what Joel said is more the issue. I think aside from the fact that they don't have the time and so on, there's a lot of anxiety because it's a language you don't know, and it means spending a lot of time learning this new way of understanding material.
I think it goes back to training. I think that's important.
But the other question is then, why is it, the last speaker was just saying we need to save psychoanalysis. Well, why does it need saving? Why is it dying or fading away? Why is neuroscience having this, big upsurge? Why, if it's really working and it's fundamental, why does it need saving?
The threat to psychoanalysis is not from neuroscience. That's not what it needs saving from. There's no competition. Psychoanalysis is a therapy. It's a set of theories and ideas. It's a method. Neuroscience doesn't threaten psychoanalysis. The threat to psychoanalysis is from alternative therapies. Right. And therapies that are perceived, often validly, as being faster or cheaper or easier or more widely available, and therefore moot the need or the indication for psychoanalysis. And that's, as perceived by psychoanalysts today, a powerful threat.
But it's also psychoanalysis itself is a threat to psychoanalysis.
Well, you're saying its closed-mindedness is a threat. I would agree.
I think it's a long discussion, but
I would agree. I agree with that.
Anna?
Yes, my name is Anna Aranyo. I'm in Hawaii, halfway on the bridge. However, I just wanted to put a few disparate ideas out on the table that because I'm partly from the other camp, I just want to suggest to the neuroscientists, everything in psychoanalysis, every process, every phenomenon is multi-determined. There is no one-to-one relationship that can be pinpointed in the brain. We not only work in a multi-determined process way, but we address the whole nervous system. It's not just the brain. Also, in support of Dr. Michels' concepts, you cannot find purpose, unconscious determinism, meaning, motives, unconscious beliefs, fantasy. They're nowhere in the brain. Just as signs and symbols, you will not locate a place in the brain where the translation from an acting out phenomenon to a finally worked through process manifests. And that is really our outcome. Our outcome is when a worked through process in psychoanalysis has changed something in the person. That was my comment.
But
you want to, Vittorio?
Very shortly, I don't think the issue is to locate or to reify psychological dimensions in the brain. That was the dream of cognitive scientists. It was cognitive scientists who spoke of the theory of mind module located in TPJ or in the anterior cingulate cortex. The goal of cognitive neuroscience, at least the goal I endorse, I'm up to, is to unravel mechanisms, which is not to locate things in the brain. I mean, beliefs are not in the brain as such. I mean, neurons don't speak the language of beliefs, of desire, of intention. What the hell they know about the world, about a bunch of ions?
Right, so then how
Calcium, natrium, that's how they deal with neurons. They are not epistemic agents, but it's a different strategy. It's a deconstruction. So what is a belief? What is a fantasy? It's a word. What's behind this word? So these are the questions neuroscience can help in answering.
I think so. Yes, I wanted to say that in this discussion, then, we should have developmental neuroscience, because psychoanalysis is developmental. I know, but then it should be incorporated in every single phenomenon. And the amount of data, well, then, forgive me, I read as much as I can, but I have yet to find a concise way of integrating this enormous mountain of data and making it relevant to psychoanalysis in the clinical process.
It gets more enormous by the day, so you better start quickly. And Siri Hustvedt, who's no longer there, she's a novelist and she can do it. Why can't analysts?
Oh, I've read mountains of neuroscience, but this is an epistemological problem, and discussed in this arena, it is my belief that it is, no matter how much you discover, it still won't be relevant to the clinical process.
Oh, that's your belief.
That's the point.
My name is Robin Ostro. I've been a patient, so I'm not any kind of official on any of these things, but there was a moment where you were talking about not enough discussion about the effects of medication between each other. And what I find very interesting is that there was a time where I was on medication, and how are you doing, and things were adjusted, and the end result was never how are you doing, how do you feel now. And I have a friend who's currently just undergoing medication treatment, and she as well is going, how am I supposed to feel? I don't feel anything. And from what I'm getting from her therapist, the therapist doesn't even seem to be that concerned as long as she's not feeling crazy or out of control. And to me, that seems like such a not irresponsible way of treating a person, but I also understand and know so many people have spoken about therapy because I've been a huge believer in the therapeutic process. How does a person get onto medication without the follow-up of a therapist? What's the purpose if, in fact, you're supposed to be evening a person's mind out so they can take in information if a person isn't even seeing a therapist? I know so many people who get medication from an internist. They have no feelings. They don't know what therapies. I'm not interested in going to, and I'll figure out these problems by myself. And yet they're given medication. And what is that purpose? That seems to me to be such an aimless purpose of medication.
So I think that's a terribly important point, that the divisions between the disciplines, it's not only a matter of disquiet to us scientifically and theoretically and philosophically, it has direct implications for patient care so that this sort of thing happens. The divisions between the disciplines get enacted on our patients. And so I think it's a very valuable contribution.
Just one note on that. There are actual scientific studies that show that a patient just given, let's say, SSRIs or pharmacological treatment, and then just given therapy, and then given both, there's a synergistic effect. So they do even better with the combination than they would do with either alone.
Well, my point is that so many people are not even given or are told we can give you medication without leading them then to a therapist. I have many friends that are in that situation where I feel very much when I was on medication, a therapist was necessary to give me things that I couldn't hear until I had some sort of calm in my soul.
So the point that both of you are making, I say again, is a very valid one, and I agree with it, that it's to the detriment of clinical care that the treatments aren't integrated. But the point I made earlier needs to be added to that. It's not only to the detriment of clinical care, it's also to the detriment of understanding what these drugs actually are doing. And I think that we in psychoanalysis have a contribution to make there, if only we would grasp the nettle.
Okay, we'll have 3 more questions. 1, 2, and 3.
Mark,
and then, Marcia, you can make your comment.
I'm Mark Mitten, and I'm a magician who has a lot of neuroscientist friends. And my question is, actually, it comes from the two of you on this end. When you talked about thermodynamics doesn't care about how statistical mechanics reports it, it is what it is. And what you were, Dr. Gallese was saying about the problem of the mind-body, which is the classic old problem of dualism. And this summer, as cognitive psychology came up, and this summer I've been having some very meaningful conversations with Ulrich Neisser about the specific moment in which he defined cognitive psychology, and then by spending time with the Gibsons, realized that he wasn't accounting for the sensory motor system. Yeah. He felt it was inadequate, and the complete despondence that came from the cognitive psychology community is still kind of beyond his grasp. It's quite moving. So I'm wondering if there's something here, just while it can be asked, that both sides seem to have a very interesting perspective on this problem of dualism. Science certainly has a problem now with this cognitive bias, and it sounds like so does psychoanalysis. So I'm wondering if there's something for the two groups, if that's some interesting common ground.
Common enemy is always a good basis for common ground. But I thought that you were going to tell us something about your experience. Did you say you were a magician? Because I thought you were going to, because your reference to the levels that Don referred to, I thought you were going to point out to us how it's something like what you have to do behind the scenes to get the magical effect. And this is why it's very important to translate.
Yes. And then the magic happens.
It's hard to fully comprehend how important it is that actual and perceived are not equal. It's confounding to me.
You did that wonderful thing in that act summer with the spinning device, and you saw the person's brain. You stared into that amazing. You've done some amazing things.
Vittorio, you want to answer? Don also.
It's not really an answer, but maybe a comment. I think we are naturally inclined to be dualist because of the way we are made. And we are bodily creatures who simultaneously entertain the thought that we own a body. So the body has always this double feature of being a constitutive part of ourselves, but simultaneously something we feel we are in possession of, we own or we disown if something goes wrong with your brain. So it's no surprise that we are still struggling with this mind-body problem many thousand years after the first thinking human being.
It's also rooted in this me, not me dichotomy that you say.
So I'm Rebecca Coleman Curtis. I'm a psychologist and psychoanalyst. And I want to come back to the bridge. I think the work that the founders of this group in terms of neuroscience and psychoanalysis has been extremely valuable, but there was a point that was made by Vittorio Gallese and Bob Michels about what is on this bridge, and it seems to me that psychoanalysis and psychology have exactly the same areas of interest, and certainly attention, selective inattention, memory, motivated forgetting, and all the work on unconscious motivation and unconscious goals, and what I would call the new affective revolution in cognitive psych. There's a new social cognitive affective science. And I know there have been speakers from social cognitive science here in the mornings, but it seems like, although the work on lesions and mirror neurons is extremely interesting, that this is really the heart of the matter in the dispute, and there's not so much link with psychologists among those here.
you have a question, or you just
Well,
make a
I
comment?
was sort of wondering if you and Mark might respond to that.
Some of my best friends are psychologists.
Short answer.
I'm Ruth Rosenbaum. I'm a psychoanalyst, and I wanted to step back for a moment from the biases and defenses of these two specialized fields, the psychoanalysts and the neuroscientists, and sort of from the perspective of some patients. And I think from some patients' point of view, there's an intuitive sense that this bridge is actually a very, very small one, that it's right sort of in the moment. And what I've noticed is that sometimes, let's say, a patient has gone through some very important transformations, and so that they've changed their location of the self within the whole morass of their very difficult and complex feelings, and they come to understand that they've also changed by that process the relationship between myself and the patient. And so in the analysis of the transference, if it works, sometimes it happens to come up, or I might even mention it, that depending on the patient, of course, it has to be appropriate, about the plasticity of the brain. And of course, I'm not a neuroscientist, so this is on a very simplistic level, but people are, it seems that, some patients where that's appropriate, they're very inspired by that, and they get it right away. In fact, they'll say things like, even, without that being a preface, they'll say things like, wow, we've done a lobotomy. In other words, they're very aware in a way that maybe when we get into more specialized corners, we can lose sight of that. So I think the bridge is in our offices every day.
I think that's to your point, that it's more a fantasy. Marcia, you have the last question.
Thank you. My comment is to you. I have no doubt that you could find that, let's say that psychoanalysis works 80% of the time, then it would be the case that neurology, described in a neurological language, would work 80% of the time. Just suppose. But I don't see how it could ever be that a neurological description could capture, for example, phenomena like transference and countertransference and repression, not in general, but repression of a particular thing, let's say a traumatic incident in childhood. How is that ever going to be rendered? And if it were rendered, would it be a causal account? Or would it merely be a corollary? And if it's not a causal account, it's hard for me to see how it could actually be useful in describing what goes on.
Well, if you look at, if it's a phenomenon, let's say transference, that exists, and it's changing a person's thoughts and behaviors, then it is somewhere being instantiated in the physical being of that person, most likely in the brain. And so at some level, if you take as a given that transference is a phenomenon that exists, that changes a person and their thought processes, their emotions, then it's inevitable that it's instantiated in some way in the brain. And I just want to understand how. And, top down or bottom up, what's causing this change? That's very difficult to know. But this thing that we're given, that we're born with, is a meaning maker machine. It takes in stimuli from the environment, it processes it, tries to make sense of the world, and then we engage in the world and act on it. And so whatever phenomena that exists, whatever perceptions, whatever thoughts we have, they're occurring somehow it's tied to the brain, to neurons firing. So I would argue that these phenomena can be described in the brain. It might take a really long time to do. We might not have the tools right now to do it. But eventually, if we do, and if we keep looking, we can, I believe, at some point, describe all these phenomena and how they're working in the brain and how they're changing us and changing our behavior and our emotions and all of that.
I think you need a philosopher in this group of people who will discuss how more research is going to go.
I have to agree with your statement of faith. But a person has to know his limitations.
Well, that's defeatist, I would argue. It's defeatist.